The suspect was arrested. The case was closed, and the world was told justice had been served. But for the people closest to this case, peace never came. This case had an ending, but no closure. The courtroom doors shut. The news cameras turned away. The town tried to move on, but something remained unfinished, unsettled, like a conversation interrupted mid-sentence. What happens when a case is solved, but the truth still feels incomplete? When the official story ties everything into a neat bow, but the people who live through it can't shake the feeling that something was left behind, because the silence that followed was louder than the crime itself. Daniel Reeves was 41 years old when his life ended. To understand why his death still haunts the people of Riverton Falls, you first need to understand who he was. He wasn't famous. He wasn't wealthy. He was a construction supervisor who left his house at 6:30 every morning with a thermos of coffee and came home smelling of sawdust and concrete. His hands were calloused, his jokes were terrible, and his daughter Emily rolled her eyes at almost everything he said, the way teenage daughters do when they still secretly adore their fathers. Riverton Falls was the kind of town where people still waved to strangers and argued about high school football with the passion of political debate. Daniel had lived there his entire life. He married Elena Cortez the summer after graduation, in a small ceremony at St. Augustine's Church with white roses and a reception in his parents' backyard. They weren't perfect. No one is. They had mortgage payments that stretched them thin and arguments about whose turn it was to take out the trash. But they were solid. They were real. Daniel coached Emily's soccer team when she was younger, even though he knew nothing about soccer. He learned. That was the kind of man he was. He showed up. He tried. His days followed a rhythm. Morning coffee. Job sites. Lunch from a cooler. Home by 6 unless they were pushing a deadline. Dinner with his family. Some television. Sleep. Repeat. It was an ordinary life. The kind most people live. The kind that shouldn't end the way his did. The last normal day was a Tuesday in October. The leaves were turning. There was a chill in the evening air that promised winter wasn't far behind. Daniel stayed late at a site across town, finishing up paperwork in the construction trailer. Elena texted him around 7 asking if he wanted her to save dinner. He replied with a thumbs-up emoji. He never made it home. Within hours, investigators believed they already knew who was responsible. Marcus Hale was 27 years old and angry at the world. At least, that's how people would describe him later, when they were trying to make sense of what happened. He'd worked under Daniel for 8 months. He was skilled with his hands, good at framing and finishing work, but he had a temper that flared hot and fast. There had been an incident 3 weeks before Daniel's death. A confrontation on the job site. Marcus had been drinking the night before and showed up late, still smelling of beer. Daniel sent him home. Marcus shouted, called Daniel names in front of the crew, said things about favoritism and being treated unfairly. Daniel stayed calm, which somehow made Marcus angrier. He stormed off, and Daniel let him go. The next day, Marcus showed up sober with an apology. Daniel accepted it. He believed in second chances. They worked together for 2 more weeks before Daniel had to let him go entirely. Budget cuts. The construction company was trimming down for the winter months, and Marcus was the newest hire. Marcus took it hard. He showed up at the site the following day, demanding to know why it was him and not someone else. Daniel tried to explain. Company policy. Last hired, first let go. Nothing personal. Marcus made it personal. Now, 3 weeks later, Daniel was dead. And Marcus Hale's name was the first one the police wrote down. They found Marcus at his apartment the next morning. He answered the door in sweatpants and a stained t-shirt, looking confused and hungover. They brought him in for questioning. The interrogation lasted 11 hours. There were no lawyers present for the first 6. Marcus waived his right to counsel, perhaps not understanding what that truly meant, perhaps believing that innocent people don't need lawyers. By hour 8, he was exhausted. By hour 10, he was breaking down. By hour 11, he confessed. The details were vague, contradictory in places. He said he went to the construction site to talk to Daniel. Said things got heated. Said Daniel fell and hit his head. Said he panicked and left. The police had their suspect. They had a confession. They had a motive. They had a timeline that sort of fit if you didn't look too closely. The media descended on Riverton Falls like birds to scattered seed. The headlines wrote themselves. Former employee confesses to killing boss. Workplace dispute turns deadly. Justice swift in Riverton Falls murder. The community exhaled. There's something deeply unsettling about not knowing who among you is capable of violence. When that question gets answered, even horribly, there's relief. The monster has a name. The threat has been contained. But the confession didn't match the physical evidence. Not completely. The medical examiner found injuries that didn't align with the fall. The timeline had gaps that no one seemed interested in filling. A witness who initially said one thing quietly changed their statement. No one wanted to slow down and ask why. Not when the answer was right there, wrapped up and ready to be filed away. The trial was brief. Marcus Hale's public defender, an overworked attorney named Sarah Chen who juggled 40 cases at once, advised him to plead guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence. Life with the possibility of parole instead of life without. Marcus sat at the defense table looking smaller than he had before. Thinner. His eyes were hollow. He answered the judge's questions in a monotone voice that suggested he'd already left his body, that the person sitting in that chair was just a shell going through motions. Do you understand the charges against you? Yes. How do you plead? A pause. A long one. Long enough that the judge asked again. Guilty. The word fell flat in the courtroom. No drama. No outburst. Just a quiet surrender. Elena Reeves sat in the second row with her daughter Emily beside her and Daniel's mother on her other side. She'd expected this moment to feel like something. Like vindication or closure or the punctuation mark at the end of a horrible sentence. It didn't. The judge handed down the sentence. Life with possibility of parole after 25 years. Marcus was led away in handcuffs. The courtroom emptied. Reporters gathered outside asking Elena how she felt now that justice had been served. She said the right words. Grateful. Relieved. Ready to move forward. But standing there under the courthouse steps with cameras pointed at her face, Elena felt nothing close to relief. The law had finished its work. The system had processed the crime and produced a result. But the grief hadn't budged. The questions hadn't quieted. That night, she lay awake in the bed she used to share with Daniel and realized something that terrified her. She didn't believe Marcus Hale's confession. Not all of it. Not the parts that mattered. And that uneasy feeling would only grow stronger with time. 3 years passed. Then 5. Then 8. Riverton Falls moved on the way small towns do, absorbing tragedy into its history and continuing forward. New families moved into the neighborhood. Old conversations faded. The coverage in the local paper dwindled to nothing. Elena went back to work at the library. Emily graduated high school and went to college 2 states away. Daniel's mother passed away in her sleep. The world kept turning. But Daniel's younger brother, Nathan, couldn't let it go. Nathan was 36 when Daniel died. He lived 2 hours away in the city, working as an accountant for a mid-sized firm. He and Daniel talked every Sunday night. Just a quick call to catch up. Sports. Work. Family gossip. Nothing profound. The comfortable shorthand of brothers who'd known each other their entire lives. When Daniel died, Nathan felt unmoored. He attended the investigation. He sat through the trial. He heard Marcus Hale confess. And something about it rang false. Nathan wasn't a detective or a lawyer. He was a man who worked with numbers and spreadsheets, who found errors by looking at columns of data until patterns emerged. So that's what he did with his brother's case. He looked at it like a ledger that didn't balance. He requested copies of the police reports through a public records request. It took months to get them, and when they arrived, large sections were redacted. But there was enough. The evidence was never tested. Physical evidence collected from the scene, DNA samples, fingerprints on surfaces that should have told a clearer story. They all sat in an evidence locker, labeled and catalogued but never actually processed. The witness who changed their statement. A man named Gerald Finch who lived near the construction site. His first statement said he saw someone leaving the area around 8:15. A single person. Later, his statement said he wasn't sure about the time. Wasn't sure about anything, really. Memory gets fuzzy. The timeline had Marcus at a bar until 7:30, confirmed by the bartender and 2 other patrons. He left intoxicated. He lived 20 minutes from the construction site. The medical examiner estimated Daniel's death between 7:45 and 8:15. It was possible. Barely. But it meant Marcus had to drive drunk, arrive at the site, confront Daniel, kill him, and leave, all within a narrow window. And the injuries suggested more than a fall. They suggested violence that takes time. Nathan spread the documents across his dining room table and stared at them until his eyes burned. The more he looked, the less the official story made sense. And then he found it. The detail that changed everything. It was a footnote in the supplementary reports, easy to miss if you weren't reading carefully. Phone records from Daniel's cell phone, documenting his activity that day. Daniel made 3 calls after 7:30. The first was to Elena at 7:33. It lasted 14 seconds. She testified she missed it because she was in the shower. The second was at 7:49, to a number that wasn't identified in the report. It lasted 3 minutes. The third was at 8:02. Same unknown number. This call lasted 4 to 7 seconds. If Daniel was killed between 7:45 and 8:15, these calls were made at the scene. Possibly during the confrontation. Possibly while Daniel was afraid or fighting for his life. Nathan requested those phone records specifically. It took a lawyer and 6 months of appeals, but he finally got them. The unknown number belonged to Thomas Avery. The name meant nothing to Nathan at first. He had to dig deeper. Thomas Avery was a local businessman who owned a small development company. He'd subcontracted work to the construction company Daniel worked for. They'd done business together. More than that. 3 months before Daniel died, there was a dispute about a payment. Thomas claimed Daniel's crew had done shoddy work on a residential project and refused to pay the final installment, $32,000. Daniel's company disagreed. They threatened legal action. The dispute was unresolved when Daniel died. After his death, the construction company dropped the matter. Easier to write it off than pursue a drawn-out legal battle while grieving an employee. But why was Daniel calling Thomas Avery the night he died? And why was this never mentioned in the investigation? Nathan took his findings to the police. The detective who handled the original case, a man named Roger Holston, was now retired. Nathan tracked him down anyway. They met at a diner. Holston was in his 60s, thick around the middle, wearing reading glasses on a chain. He ordered coffee and a slice of pie and listened to Nathan's presentation with the expression of someone being asked to care about something he'd filed away years ago. Marcus Hale confessed, Holston said when Nathan finished. What more do you want? I want to know why my brother was calling Thomas Avery that night. Could have been about work. Could have been about anything. Did you look into it? Holston took a long sip of coffee. We had our guy. He confessed. Case closed. But what if he didn't do it? What if someone else was involved? Then he should have said so. Nathan felt heat rising in his chest. He was questioned for 11 hours without a lawyer. Maybe he just told you what you wanted to hear. Holston set down his cup carefully. Listen, I understand you're grieving. I do. But you're not a detective. You're an accountant playing investigator because you can't accept that your brother's death was senseless. But that's what most deaths are. Senseless. There's no hidden conspiracy. No big revelation that's going to make it hurt less. I'm not looking for it to hurt less. I'm looking for the truth. The truth is Marcus Hale killed your brother. He confessed. He's in prison. That's the truth. Nathan left the diner with his documents and a growing certainty that Detective Holston had taken the easy answer because easy answers close cases. Because budgets are tight and time is limited, and one confession is worth 1,000 hours of additional investigation. But reopening the case would reopen old wounds. Nathan hired a private investigator named Lisa Trudeau. She was in her 50s, former police detective herself, who'd left the force over disagreements about how cases were handled. She worked alone now, methodically, with a reputation for being thorough and expensive. Nathan paid a retainer with money he'd been saving for a down payment on a house. Some things matter more than real estate. Lisa started where Nathan couldn't. She interviewed people. She asked questions that sounded casual but weren't. She followed paper trails through business records and property deeds and financial statements. Thomas Avery, she discovered, had financial troubles around the time of Daniel's death. His development company was overextended. He had loans coming due. That $32,000 he owed Daniel's company. He didn't have it. Not without selling assets or defaulting on other obligations. 2 weeks after Daniel died and the case against Marcus Hale was closed, Thomas Avery received a cash infusion. A private loan from an investor. $50,000. Enough to keep his business afloat. Lisa kept digging. She found something else. A man named Vincent Cora, who had done occasional work for Thomas Avery. Security. Collections. The kind of work that exists in gray areas. Vincent had a record. Assault. Battery. Served 3 years in the mid-90s. Since then, he'd kept his name clean, at least officially. But people Lisa talked to, off the record, suggested Vincent still did the kind of work that doesn't appear on tax returns. The night Daniel died, Vincent's car was seen near the construction site. Not by the police. By a teenager named Jamie who'd been cutting through the area on his bike, coming home late from a friend's house. Jamie mentioned it to his parents. His parents told him it wasn't his business. No one asked him about it. Lisa found Jamie, now a young man in his 20s. He remembered. A dark sedan. He remembered because it was parked in a weird spot, half hidden behind a pile of building materials. He thought about saying something at the time but figured adults had it handled. The pieces were coming together, but they formed an uncomfortable picture. One that suggested Marcus Hale might have been at the construction site that night. But he wasn't alone. Or he wasn't there when Daniel died. Or his confession left out crucial details because he was scared or coerced or protecting someone. This wasn't about innocence anymore. It was about completeness. About whether the full story had been told or whether justice had settled for a version that was convenient. Nathan presented everything to the district attorney's office. It took 3 meetings. They listened politely. They said they'd review the material. They said these things take time. Months passed. Then a letter arrived. The DA's office had reviewed the supplementary information and determined that it did not warrant reopening the case. Marcus Hale had confessed. He'd been given due process. His conviction stood. The letter was polite, formal, final. Nathan sat at his dining room table with the letter in his hand and understood something that broke him a little. The system wasn't designed to seek perfect truth. It was designed to process cases efficiently. And sometimes, efficiency and truth diverge. Elena didn't want Nathan to pursue this. She told him as much when he called to update her. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice tired. "Because Daniel deserves the full truth." "Daniel's dead, Nathan. The truth won't bring him back. Don't you want to know what really happened?" A long pause. In the background, Nathan heard the sound of dishes clinking. Elena doing mundane tasks while having this conversation about her murdered husband. "I know what happened," she finally said. "Someone killed him. Marcus Hale is in prison. My life moved forward. Emily's life moved forward. What you're doing, it's pulling us back. But what if Marcus didn't act alone? What if Thomas Avery? Then what?" Elena's voice rose. "Then what? Nathan, what changes? Do they reopen the case? Do they put Marcus on trial again? Do they drag Emily back into that courtroom to relive it? Do they put me on the news again to talk about my dead husband? What good does any of this do?" Nathan didn't have an answer. You think you're honoring Daniel, Elena continued, softer now. But what you're really doing is refusing to let him rest. I made peace with this. It wasn't easy, but I did it. Please don't take that away from me. They didn't speak for 2 months after that call. In Riverton Falls, word got around about Nathan's investigation. Small towns have ways of making information travel. People had opinions. Some thought Nathan was brave. Others thought he was delusional, chasing shadows because he couldn't accept reality. The community divided quietly. Those who wanted to leave the past buried against those who believed truth mattered more than comfort. A newspaper article appeared. Local interest story, Brothers' quest for answers years after murder. It presented Nathan sympathetically but also quoted people saying the case was closed, justice was served, and reopening old wounds helped no one. Thomas Avery issued a statement through his lawyer. He'd cooperated fully with the original investigation. He had nothing to hide. The phone calls from Daniel that night were about work, about scheduling. Nothing sinister. Any suggestion otherwise was defamatory. Vincent Cora couldn't be found for comment. Lisa Trudeau reported that he'd left town 2 years prior. Current whereabouts unknown. Nathan sat in his apartment surrounded by documents and evidence and witness statements and felt the weight of a terrible realization. Even if he was right, even if he could prove Marcus Hale didn't act alone or that the confession was coerced or that Thomas Avery had involvement, it wouldn't undo anything. Daniel would still be dead. Marcus would still be in prison. Elena and Emily would still have lost years to grief. The truth, if it came out, would just redistribute the pain differently. There are no real winners when you dig up graves looking for answers. 5 years after Nathan started his investigation, Marcus Hale was granted a parole hearing. He'd served 13 years. His behavior in prison was exemplary. He'd taken classes, earned a degree, participated in rehabilitation programs. Nathan attended the hearing. So did Elena, though she sat on the opposite side of the room. Marcus looked different. Older, obviously. Thinner. His hair was graying at the temples. He wore glasses now. When he spoke, his voice was steady but hollow, like he practiced these words so many times they'd lost connection to feeling. He expressed remorse. He took responsibility for his actions. He said he thought about Daniel Reeves every day and would for the rest of his life. He said prison had given him time to reflect on his anger, his drinking, his poor choices. He was a different person now. The parole board asked questions. Marcus answered them carefully. Yes, he understood the gravity of what he'd done. Yes, he had a plan for reentry if released. A cousin in another state offered him a job. He had a place to stay. He'd continue therapy. He'd stay away from alcohol. Then one of the board members asked a question that made the room go still. In your confession, you said Daniel Reeves fell and hit his head during a confrontation. But the medical examiner's report suggests injuries inconsistent with a fall. Can you clarify what happened? Marcus stared at his hands. The silence stretched long enough to be uncomfortable. It was a long time ago. I was drunk. I don't remember everything clearly. But you confessed to causing his death. Yes. Did someone else hurt Daniel Reeves? Marcus looked up. For just a moment, something flickered across his face. Fear. Regret. A calculation of what truth costs versus what silence protects. No, he said finally. It was just me. The parole board deliberated for 40 minutes and denied his request. Insufficient acceptance of responsibility, they said. Inconsistencies in his account raised concerns about his credibility. Outside, Nathan caught up with Marcus's lawyer. He's protecting someone, Nathan said. The lawyer, a woman in her 40s with a briefcase that had seen better days, sighed. Maybe. Or maybe he just doesn't remember. Or maybe the confession was coerced 13 years ago and now has stuck with it because changing his story makes him look wise. The system isn't designed for nuance, Mr. Reeves. So what happens now? He applies again in 5 years. And we hope the board is more sympathetic. Nathan watched the lawyer walk away and felt exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't fix. Elena approached slowly. They hadn't spoken since their argument years before, but here in this courthouse hallway, the space between them felt less hostile. "I don't know if he did it alone," she said quietly. "I've never known for sure. But Nathan, I need you to stop. I need this to be over." "How can it be over when we don't know the truth?" "Because the truth doesn't change anything." Her eyes were wet, but she didn't cry. "Daniel's still gone. That's the only truth that matters to me. Everything else is just details. And those details are eating you alive." She was right. Nathan had lost relationships over this obsession. He'd spent thousands of dollars he didn't have. He'd sacrificed years of his own life trying to understand the end of his brother's. And for what? A picture that was slightly clearer but no less tragic. Some cases are solved in court, but never in the hearts of those left behind. The legal system had processed Daniel Reeves's death and produced a result. Marcus Hale confessed. Marcus Hale went to prison. The case closed. But the truth, the full, complete, uncomfortable truth, remained elusive. Perhaps Thomas Avery had been involved. Perhaps Vincent Cora had been there. Perhaps Marcus's confession left out details because he was terrified or protecting someone, or simply telling investigators what they wanted to hear after 11 hours of questioning. Or perhaps the official story was correct and Nathan had wasted years chasing shadows because accepting a senseless, straightforward tragedy was harder than believing in conspiracy. Nathan would never know for certain. That's what haunted him most. Not the injustice, but the uncertainty. The gaps that couldn't be filled. The questions that had no answers. Would you accept closure if it didn't feel real? Or would you keep asking questions, knowing they might never be answered? That night, Nathan went home to his apartment. He gathered all the documents, all the evidence, all the notes from his investigation, and he put them in boxes. He labeled them carefully. He stored them in his closet. He didn't throw them away. He couldn't. But he stopped actively investigating. He stopped calling lawyers and private investigators. He stopped lying awake at night arranging timelines in his head. He didn't find peace, but he found something close to it. Acceptance, maybe, or just exhaustion. Elena scattered Daniel's ashes that spring. She'd kept them on her mantle for 13 years, unable to let go. But now, finally, she took them to the lake where Daniel had proposed to her 23 years earlier. She poured them into the water and watched them disappear into currents that would carry them away from her forever. Emily came with her. They stood together on the shore, mother and daughter, two people who'd learned to live with a Daniel-shaped absence in their lives. "Do you think about him every day?" Emily asked. "No," Elena said honestly. "Not every day anymore." "Is that terrible?" "No, I think that's healing." Marcus Hale remained in prison. He'd be eligible for parole again in 5 years. Maybe he'd be released. Maybe he'd die behind bars. Either way, he'd lost decades of his life to a crime he confessed to, whether or not he'd committed it alone or under duress or exactly as he described. Thomas Avery's business eventually failed. Market conditions, people said. Bad timing. He moved to Florida and started over. Whether he had any involvement in Daniel Reeves's death remains speculation, the kind of rumor that circulates in small towns but never solidifies into fact. Vincent Cora stayed gone. Some people leave and don't come back. Their stories end with an ellipsis rather than a period. And Nathan, he went to therapy. He talked about his brother, about obsession, about the difference between seeking justice and seeking control in an uncontrollable world. He learned to sit with uncertainty. It wasn't comfortable, but it was survivable. Years later, he'd still think about the case, about the gaps in the timeline and the untested evidence and the phone calls Daniel made before he died. But the thoughts no longer consumed him. They were just part of his internal landscape, like old scars that ached in certain weather. Justice without peace is just another kind of loss. But sometimes loss is all we get. The world doesn't owe us closure. It doesn't promise that every story will end with all questions answered and all wounds healed. Sometimes a case is solved, but the truth remains fractured. Sometimes we have to live in that fractured space, carrying uncertainty like extra weight, learning to walk despite it. Daniel Reeves died on a Tuesday in October. His case was solved within days. A man confessed and went to prison. The system functioned as designed. Justice, in its legal definition, was served. But the people who loved Daniel never stopped feeling like something was missing. Some essential piece of the story that would make it all make sense. They searched for it in different ways. Elena by trying to move forward, Nathan by digging into the past, Emily by building a life separate from the tragedy. None of them found what they were looking for. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is simply that they kept living. That grief didn't destroy them even when truth eluded them. That they found ways to honor Daniel not by solving the mystery of his death, but by choosing not to let his death define their entire existence. This case was solved. The court said so. The records show it. But it didn't bring peace. Because peace isn't a verdict or a sentence or a confession. Peace is something we build for ourselves in the aftermath, in the space between what happened and what we wish had happened. And sometimes, despite everything, we manage to build it anyway. If stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing. Some truths take time to surface, because justice without peace is just another kind of loss.